Hello and welcome to the European Report. In this edition, we're here in our studios in London because the European Parliament is currently in recess. So in this programme today, we're going to be discussing Israel's military operation against Hamas in Gaza and the aftermath of this, and saying, where does Israel go now? And in today's programme, I'm joined by Thomas Sandel, the founder and director of the European Coalition for Israel. Thomas, it's great to have you in our studios here in London for this month's edition of the European Report. Can you just give us an update of some of the activities that you've been involved with ECI, knowing that it's been a very, very busy summer, and it seems like a totally different world from the last time we're in the European Parliament back in June.
Well, thank you, Simon. It's good to be in London. It's good to be back in the studio. It's true. I mean, 2 months ago feels like a different decade almost. And this is, of course, how politics works. You know, we never know what will happen the next day, the next week. And only God knows where we are at in 1 month from now, where we will hopefully meet in the European Parliament. It's true. This summer has been very exceptional. You know, usually we try to keep some summer holidays this time of the year, right?
Absolutely.
But it has been very difficult. I mean, my thoughts has always been with the Israelis, with the Jews, watching what is happening in Gaza, knowing that we just cannot take a beach holiday while our people are suffering, our people are in a war. And it's very important, I believe, also for all of us to understand that when we mention the word war today, it has a double meaning, or there are many meanings to it. So of course, there's nothing we can do militarily other than pray, but there's so much that we can do in terms of standing up for Israel in media, social media, being in touch with our elected leaders. And during the last few weeks, I mean, it has been more hectic than probably ever during our 11 years of activities. Let me also mention that in the second week of July, we were in New York. We had meetings at the United Nations in preparation for what we are planning for the opening session of the general debate in September. We were also in the U.S. Congress. We were invited by the leadership of the U.S. Congress to an event where Raoul Wallenberg, whose name we have mentioned many times in this program, he was honored by the U.S. Congressional Gold Medal.
Oh, incredible!
So it was a good visit. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to do a special program, I think, on Raoul Wallenberg, who was that incredible Swedish diplomat that did so much to rescue so many Jewish people from the hands of the Nazis, and sadly was taken captive by the Soviets. So we don't know what's happened to him. So hopefully, with the work that you're doing and through a lot of prayer, we can find out what's happened to him, and this can bring a lot of peace to his family. But I mean, the last time when the European Parliament, I know the main issue we really discussed was the kidnap of these 3 Israeli teenagers by Hamas. Sadly, a few days after filming that, they were found dead. And now we're in a situation since then, almost a full-scale war has broken out. So it started with Hamas firing 240 rockets into Israel in one day, which 3.5 million Israelis came under the range of Hamas's rockets and missiles, which Israel then responded by launching Operation Protective Edge to wipe out Hamas's terror tunnels, its rockets and missiles, and much of its terrorist infrastructure. Can you give us maybe a little bit of context about some of the events that really led up to Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza this summer?
Well, obviously, you mentioned the triggering factor being the murder of these 3 innocent Jewish students. But of course, we have to remember the context of the missiles being fired into Israel on a continuous basis. It never makes the news. It was like business as usual when there are, a number of missiles fired into southern Israel in particular. And of course, this is not a situation any UN member state would tolerate. My country, Finland, would not tolerate it. Your country, Britain, would not tolerate missiles being fired, you say, from France over the Channel. so the situation was becoming more and more unbearable. I think the interesting thing, and I'm sure you have spoken about that in the program, is of course the tunnels, the whole idea of tunnels being dug into crossing the border in kilometers coming into Israel. The extent of the networks of these terrorist tunnels was, of course, not something that neither the Israelis or the international communities really had any idea of. And I'm sure that you have shared on this program as well how it is now revealed that there was a real plot and a plan to use these tunnels to release a terrorist attack in its most brutal size for Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. So unless Israel would have had the reason, a really legitimate reason to go into Gaza and go in with the ground troops and start looking to see what's happening there, of course we would be facing perhaps one of the most brutal attacks on Israel in Israel's modern history just a few weeks from now. So of course the triggering factor, the murder of these 3 innocent Jewish people, where that was the tipping point, and the Israeli government just realized, hey, we just cannot let this continue to happen. We have a responsibility for our citizens, and hence they started this Operation Protective Edge.
And also we had the other dynamics as well. I think back in April that Hamas became part of the Palestinian government of national unity with Fatah.
Yeah.
So surely there has to be some responsibility laid at the feet of Fatah for aligning themselves with an international terrorist organization who in their covenant charter calls for the destruction of the state of Israel and the Jewish people worldwide. And yet there's been little condemnation of Fatah for their alignment and engagement with Hamas.
Yeah.
By the international community.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of issues which are interesting when you mentioned the unity government. The fact that the US, the European Union, they saw this as something positive. They said, finally they get their act together, they have a unity government. But at the same time, trying to not remember what they have decided once and for all, to say Hamas is a terrorist organization, we will never deal with them. All of a sudden, that was forgotten. And of course, I think this made the government in Jerusalem quite upset and nervous and said, well, what's going on in the international community? All of a sudden, they are just welcoming Hamas in their arms, knowing that there has not been a change of heart in any way or shape. So I think that's also something that really, in a way, helped to explain the background to the current crisis.
And what do you think Hamas objectives were in launching these rockets and missiles? I mean, did they expect a ground invasion by Israel? Did they do this? I know that Hamas had difficulties in paying the salaries of many civil servants in Gaza, and that's one of the main reasons why they entered into a national unity government. But to actually launch the rockets and missiles they did, which meant that Israel's northern city of Haifa came in the range of these rockets, so did Tel Aviv and even Jerusalem. I mean, what have they gained from this strategically? And why did Hamas decide to launch this attack at this time?
I think there are two perspectives that I would like to share, and I think both of them are important. One is that Hamas, they calculated the situation correctly. They know how cynical the world is. They knew that if they can bring Israel into a war situation, well, they will have to go in with the ground troops. They will use people as human shields. Civilians will die in the hundreds. It doesn't matter, how this happened. Although people understand this is being done on purpose by Hamas, Western media is very simple. You see a picture of a dead civilian, it's a child, and the public will react in a particular way. They will not ask the questions, how did this happen? And this will sway public opinion within, I say, a week or a few weeks, to the extent where you have the governments now taking the sides of Hamas instead of Israel. And if you look at the situation, and I think we have to say this to the credit of our political leadership, the European Union on the 22nd of July, when they met, the foreign ministers met last time, we wrote an open letter just the day before to say, listen, the European leaders will have to demand the dismantling of Hamas, and they will have to make a statement condemning the rise of anti-Semitism, which follows from this crisis. They did exactly that. This is the 22nd of July, and Jerusalem were completely taken by surprise and said, well, how can it be that Catherine Ashton, the European leaders, are on our side? I can also say from diplomatic sources that the Israelis knew this was a time game. They knew that they had a few weeks to finish the work. During this time or after this time, the public opinion will have swayed to the point where the governments would change their perception. So what we hear now, just a few weeks after August 22nd, is something completely different, a different language. People, even in this country, condemning Israel for disproportionate violence, for war crimes. And so what I'm saying is that Hamas, they're not stupid. They knew exactly how naive the Western audience is. Second thing I would want to say, and this may almost come across as conspirational, but isn't it interesting that while the focus of international media has been on Gaza, something of the most brutal violence and killings, to the extent that some people already call it the beginning of a genocide, is taking place just a few hundred miles away from Gaza. And it's only now that this is becoming headline news, because while international media and the UN and the European Union were focusing on Gaza, Christians and religious minorities were killed, they were raped, they were murdered in the most brutal way just a few hours away from Gaza, and the international community did not care. So, of course, I would say, knowing that Hamas and the Islamic State, they're sisters and brothers, if the Islamic State wants to do what they were planning to do, what better way to put up a smokescreen than to make something happen in Gaza, and you will know that this is only the story that international media will be interested in.
Yes, which was a very, very valid point. I mean, you could also mention the fact, for example, Libya was very much in the news, and the British had to evacuate their embassy and British citizens there, and the same with Americans, and there was virtually no media coverage of that crisis whatsoever. So, but there has been a media obsession with Israel, and we can go into that and many particular factors. But you have to ask, how did Israel, for example, during this conflict, allow the green light for journalists to go into Gaza? And surely they should have had a news blackout like they did during Operation Cast Lead 2008 and 9. And do you believe that the Western media have fallen into Hamas's media trap of reporting on using asymmetrical warfare, using children and the innocent as human shields in order to bring international condemnation on Israel? How much responsibility do you lay at our Western media coverage of this conflict for actually empowering Hamas and bringing international condemnation through Israel, even leading to the rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing throughout the streets of Europe?
Yeah, I think that international media is really fueling a campaign of not only anti-Zionism but anti-Semitism right now by this very one-sided reports from Gaza. And I think there are, again, two things that I'd like to bring to your attention. One is, of course, that we know that Hamas have their own guidelines for journalists to say and for their own media activists to say, well, this is what you can report, this is what you cannot report. For example, it's interesting that you will never see a picture of a Hamas combatant, you know, being died, or a fighter, or this or that. You only see picture of civilians. Well, this is something that is being asked of Hamas to say, well, listen, we want, always when you mention a person that died, please remember to add the, to say it's a civilian, it's a civilian, it's a civilian. So that's one thing. If you're a journalist, and my background is in journalism, your main objective is to make sure you come out alive from a conflict zone. So, and we know that those journalists that would not comply with Hamas guidelines, you know, they put their lives in danger. So this is one thing, and this is of course something that I think should be brought to the attention of journalists worldwide, and there should be an academic discussion about ethical standards. Can you really work on the terms of a terrorist organization? That's one thing, but sadly, we know in many countries, I can speak best for the Nordic countries, that the journalists as a profession tend, and there are academic research to support this, they tend to be disproportionately represented in political parties which are the most critical of Israel. So it's not only that Hamas makes it difficult for journalists to work, you have a tendency, and I can mention many, many examples, people who go out, they are more activists than journalists. And this doesn't help us to get a fair picture of what is happening in Gaza.
And let's hear Netanyahu talking about the coverage of by foreign journalists on Israel's war against Hamas, either support terrorism or support democracy.
It stands before the international community with a wave of radical terrorists that are now seizing vast cities, civilian population, and doing exactly the tactic that Hamas is doing. That's exactly what ISIL is doing, what Hezbollah is doing, what Boko Haram is doing, what Hamas is doing is what Al-Qaeda is doing. And the test now is not merely the test for the international community's attitude towards Israel, an embattled democracy using legitimate means against these double war crimes of targeting civilians and hiding behind civilians. The test is for the civilized world itself, how it is able to defend itself.
Netanyahu said if the world does not hold Hamas accountable, it will lead to many more civilian casualties across the globe.
And Thomas, don't we need to get a real sense of what Netanyahu is saying here, that Israel is on the front lines in this terror war against Hamas? And we've got to understand that Hamas is a terrorist organization. Not only are they a terrorist organization, but they're actually in government, they're in power in Gaza, and they are subjecting the people to fear and tyranny. These ordinary Gazans who do not want a conflict with Israel and yet are being dragged in one because of Hamas's actions. But, you know, is there not a danger that if we don't allow Israel to defend herself, then what we're going to see is this rise of radical Islam sweep across Europe. Already it's been quoted about 5,000 British and European Muslims have gone to join ISIS, the Islamic State, in its operations in Syria and also in Iraq. And surely when they come back, that poses a real challenge and is a direct threat to our national European security.
I think there is a hope among people such as myself that the news of the last few days of what is happening in northern Iraq would open the eyes of the Western world, and they would understand that, as we said in a press release that we are preparing for tomorrow, that Jews and Christians face the same enemy. ISIS and Hamas, they're sisters and brothers, they're the same aim, the same ideology, and we know that ISIS are active as well in Gaza. And I think, and I would hope that at some point the West will have to choose sides. And it cannot be that the West should be on the side of terrorism. And as you said, I think we may sooner rather than later also face a new situation in Europe with the returning jihadists. We saw it in Brussels, and we know that we are talking about hundreds of returning jihadists. And there's a certain percentage of these that are committed to doing the same work in Europe as they did in Iraq. And when you look at some of the graphic pictures, I've been very active on social media, but I always had resistance to passing on certain pictures. When you see pictures which are fresh of beheaded people, you know, children standing besides, you know, a head, and his father is saying, "I'm proud of my son," you have to ask yourself, what is the world coming to? Who are these people? And it's not rocket science to see that the same ideology which is motivating these people in Syria, in Iraq, is also active in Gaza. And we also need to mention, and you did it, and I think it's important, that the people of Gaza are getting fed up with Hamas. You see, we have to remember this is a dictatorship. It's a terrorist state, if you want to call it a state. But the people are fed up. And if there would just be any way, and I think this would be the time for the international community to come in and say, listen, we need to help Israel clean up Gaza. It's not to be against the Palestinians or the people living in Gaza, but it's to give all these people a life that they all deserve. It's the dignity of the people in Gaza. And so if people are friends of humanity, if people are friends of these suffering people in Gaza and elsewhere in the Middle East, you have to know that you're on the right side of this conflict. You just cannot support a dictatorship of terrorists that are not only, as Netanyahu said, targeting Israeli civilians. They don't care about their own people. And this is a real, crime against humanity.
And Thomas, they don't either care about sacred spaces as well, as
No.
you can see in this news clip produced by the Israeli Defense Force of how they found not only weapons and arms in this mosque, but also the deadly terror tunnels that were going to be used to carry out a horrendous terrorist attack on Israel come Rosh Hashanah.
זאת הכניסה הראשית למסגד. הייתה היתקלות עם 5 מחבלים ששמרו והגנו על המסגד. אנחנו יורדים לקומת המרתף במסגד. זו קומת המרתף, כמו שאנחנו רואים אותה. חדר כלי העבודה, בעיקר כלי העבודה בחפירה שנמצאו כאן. בית התפילה שנמצא בקומת המרתף. אלה חלק מהאמצעים שנמצאו פה במרחב. זה בעצם נקודה שהייתה חשובה למחבלים. יכולים לראות פה פיר בעומק 14 מטר, שבעצם ממנו התחבר לרשת מנהרות לחימה במרחב הכפר. מנהרה נוספת, פיר נוסף, בעצם שנמצא פה, עדיין לא חקרנו אותו, אבל גם הוא אפשר לראות, נכנס פנימה, יש פה ימינה ושמאלה וממשיך פנימה.
And Thomas, sadly, we didn't really get to see that type of video footage on many of our European mainstream TV news networks. But I think it shows the extent of the use of Hamas's use of hospitals, of schools, of mosques, and how this was used as obviously a shelter for Hamas operatives, but also used as terror tunnels and an operation base where they would all gather, go into the mosque, into the basement, and then spread themselves throughout the whole Gaza Strip and even into Israeli territory.
Sure, yeah.
Now, surely the international community has to wake up to the danger of these terror tunnels and why Israel had to do what it did.
Yeah.
There's a lot of speculation in Israel, a lot of anger and a lot of hurt about this recent conflict, the way that Israel's been condemned internationally.
Yeah.
Do you believe the answer for Israel is to either to occupy the Gaza Strip again, to actually contain this threat from Hamas, ISIS and other Islamist terrorist organizations? Because clearly we might get in a scenario where we only see this happen again in 2 years' time if Hamas is allowed to rebuild its military infrastructure.
Well, Simon, you know, the last thing I would want to do is to give advice to the Israeli government, knowing how hostile the international community is. I think there would be a legitimate reason for doing that, for you know, if you want to use the word occupy by Gaza, because that's the word that is being still used today, so they may just do it properly.
Absolutely.
And it's also true that regardless of how much restraint they show in their operation, regardless of the ethical standards that they're trying to live up to, they don't get much praise for that in international media or international institutions. So I think there is a point to make to say that listen, we are not going to be applauded by the international community regardless of what we do. We might as well get the work done. But I would still hope, and that's what I said earlier, that this is not only a battle for Israel, this is a battle for the free world, for the international community. We now see where it's leading in Iraq. We see the situation in Europe with the growing hostilities, not only to Israel, but to Jewish people. And of course, the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe right now, as we speak, is probably unprecedented after the Second World War. We'll have to see the numbers. You know, next year we'll see the numbers. But I think it's fair to say that what we will see this year we have not seen after the Second World War. There were high numbers in the early 2000, the Second Intifada, around the time when we started the European Coalition for Israel. Because and ever since we've been warning to say that, listen, there's a real danger of return of anti-Semitism to Europe. And if I just look at media clips from the last few days, from Germany, from France, from Brittany, from Belgium, elsewhere, many compare this situation to the 1930s, and just imagine that you have a situation in Germany, of all places, where synagogues are being vandalized and rabbis are being chased, where you have an elected Nazi in the European Parliament from Germany. We have to realize this is not business as usual. We are entering a very dangerous time.
No, I believe you are, and maybe that's one of the consequences from some of the hideous media reporting that we've seen on this conflict, not giving balance to the other side. But in terms of going back a little bit to solving one of the problems, and certainly we're at a difficult stage of negotiations regarding the current ceasefire at the moment. Now, the Egyptians are very much leading the initiative to get a long-term ceasefire in place. There's discussions about bringing Fatah back and particularly controlling the Rafah crossing and opening up the border between Gaza and Egypt under the control of Fatah. But surely, how can that work internationally when Fatah have already aligned themselves with Hamas, with this Palestinian government and national unity? Surely that's exactly what Hamas wants. So how can Israel convince the world that this would be a bad scenario for Israel and the people of Israel?
Yeah, I think for Israel, always their options is not one option which is good and another one which is bad. It's usually one which is bad and one which is worse. So again, it's a tricky situation. I would refrain from giving a clear answer to that one. what I do want to bring in is again two things. One is, of course, the irrelevance of the so-called Palestinian state, which is an observer in the United Nations. When U.S. Foreign Secretary John Kerry came to the Middle East, he wanted to speak with Hamas, Qatar, and Turkey. He didn't even bother to speak with Fatah. I mean, is that a strange situation or what? To say that we don't even want to bring in Fatah in the discussions, and this is their legitimate representative at the United Nations. Something is very fishy. And secondly, why on earth would you want to try reach a solution with Qatar and Turkey? So if we have again to look behind Hamas, and we see Iran, but not only Iran, we see Qatar, who are financing all these terror activities. We see Turkey, again, who are playing a very non-constructive role. These are the troublemakers. And I think the other side of the story, of course, is that Israel, strangely enough, probably have more friends in the region right now than enemies. So when you look at the other Gulf states, when you look at Egypt, I mean, even Egypt and Fatah, there's nothing more that they are wishing and hoping and praying for than Israel would destroy Hamas completely. But again, what they get instead is not necessarily they haven't sold much, but of course they have avoided the worst case scenario.
No, absolutely, and the Egyptian hatred for the Muslim Brotherhood, I think, is spearheading this stronger strategic alliance with Israel we're seeing in the region, together with the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and also Saudi Arabia as well, primarily because we're seeing a lack of American engagement and involvement in the region, which is producing some interesting alignments, to say the least. But really, where do we go now? Looking at this conflict now and the aftermath of this. I mean, Israel has been accused by the UN of war crimes. There's talk about Israel going to the International Court in The Hague for war crimes. We're seeing this international condemnation through the international community, together with calls for economic sanctions against Israel, particularly the goods and services produced in Judea and Samaria by the Jewish settlers, by Christian organizations like Christian Aid. We're seeing the rise of boycott, divestments and sanctions, campaigning against Israel. That these are very, very difficult days for Israel to navigate diplomatically. I mean, is Israel prepared, and is the Christian community prepared for the backlash that we're going to see against Israel in the coming weeks and months?
Well, Simon, you know just as well as I know it's going to be an ugly autumn. This is not anything we've been hoping for, but all the indicators are pointing in the same direction. And it's exactly, the question is what happens the day after. There's a ceasefire, there's a temporary truce in the situation. And we know exactly, even from the European Union, and I said they were initially very constructive, and we have to give them credit for that. But at the same time, in July, at one of the council meetings, they again brought up the issue of the disputed territories, what they call the occupied territories, and the need to mark goods, the need to basically put pressure on Israel economically and diplomatically, and this is something that we see, and of course we as an organization, we as Christians, this is where we can become involved. Because this is really a battle for the minds and the hearts of Christians, the minds and the hearts of people out there. And we already see in our Christian community, it's much more difficult to be a friend of Israel when you face these very one-sided media reports. So what we need first and foremost is really to do our homework, to read, to make sure we get the alternative news resources which are available, but you don't get them in BBC, sadly. You don't get them in, well, I don't have to mention the names of all the newspapers we don't like. But I think the beauty of social media, the beauty of internet is that we have a completely new media situation. And I can tell you, Simon, in the last few weeks, the number of phone calls I have had with editors where I have been able to correct them and I say, listen, this is not factual, you need to make a correction. And you just realize how much pressure they are under. And because today a journalist that have a deadline to say, well, you need the story in by 4 o'clock, and you then have a well-educated reader who may have a doctor's degree in the same topic, who knows 100 times more than the journalist. It's an asymmetrical situation. And this is where we should be active. This is where we should be active on Facebook, sharing this information. This is where we should be active, writing letters to the editors, picking up the telephone and call them, but also to make direct contact to our elected leaders. I saw a quote from your new Foreign Secretary just last week, where he was blaming Israel, and he said, well, we have to do something about this situation. And he then interestingly said, because of the amount of emails that I'm getting, and he said, well, I'm not only getting them from the Muslim community, but from others as well. It's an interesting way to formulate foreign policy. But I think it's very enlightening for us to understand that one email that you can generate, that you can send, it's being taken notice of. And if you can, through social media or through other networks, friends, church, if you can encourage people to say, please send that one email, it can change, it has the potential of changing foreign policy. And this is where all of us are needed in these coming weeks and months when things will heat up.
And let's see Ron Prosser, Israel's ambassador to the UN, defending Israel against the accusations of war crimes in the United Nations.
It might be too much for you, or to ask you, to stand on our side in this battle between civilization and barbarism, but at least have the decency to swallow your selective outrage as Israel wages war against the extremist groups seeking to eradicate the values that we all hold very dear. Mr. President, Israel is on the front line of the war against radical extremism. The battle we fight today is the same battle that you all will fight tomorrow. Hamas, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, shares a disdain for democracies, a contempt for modernity, and a willingness to target innocent civilians. And yet, some of you have abandoned the only democracy in the Middle East, standing against the tide of terrorism. What does this say about your values? What does it mean for the next generation? This institution is being held hostage by some in this assembly who are the worst human rights abusers. The Arab nations, backed by some members of the non-aligned movement, may have the numbers, but they don't have the morals. They use the majority to convene special sessions, issue condemnations, and push through resolutions demonizing Israel. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the Arab states passed a resolution saying that the terror tunnels were actually simply an irrigation system and that the rockets were nothing more than shooting stars. Mr. President, Israel did everything in its power to avoid this conflict. We accepted every ceasefire, even as the people of Israel came under attack. The world witnessed Hamas's understanding of ceasefires. What were those understandings? Israel seizes and Hamas fires. We were left with no choice. We send our sons and daughters into Gaza for one reason, and one reason only: to restore sustained quiet in Israel and disrupt the Hamas infrastructure that has produced terror and violence for well over a decade. Israel deeply regrets the loss of innocent lives. We are heartbroken, as each and every one in this room, by the stories and images of loss and grief that have emerged from Gaza. To us, the death of any civilian, Israeli or Palestinian, is a tragedy. But Israel faces an enemy that does not abide by any rules or morals. Hamas sees no problem with abusing international humanitarian centers and religious institutions for terrorist purposes. It stores weapons in UN facilities, transport terrorists in ambulances, and fire rockets indiscriminately from mosques, schools, and hospitals deep into the heart of civilian centers. 6 stories below Gaza, 6 stories below Gaza, are miles of dense terror tunnels crisscrossing like a giant web, reinforced with thousands of tons of concrete and supported by massive beams. These terror tunnels extend like tentacles into Israel, ending at the doorsteps of our communities. For years, the international community criticized Israel for restricting the entry of construction material into Gaza. And for years, the international community believed it was sending money to develop Gaza. In truth, like I said, the construction materials and $8 were only aiding Hamas to build terrorist strongholds. The fact that Hamas directs its budget underground rather than above ground proves once again that it has no concern for the welfare of the Palestinian people. Let me remind you that Hamas has a seat in the Palestinian Unity Government. This idea is absolutely absurd. It's like inviting ISIS to participate in the Iraqi government, and yet when it comes to Israel, this absurdity is somehow acceptable. Few nations have the courage to admit that Hamas is committing a double war crime, targeting Israeli civilians while hiding behind Palestinian civilians. Fewer still have the courage to admit that Hamas is willing to see its own children killed so it can build sympathy for its cause. By not vocally and unequivocally condemning Hamas, you are condemning another generation of Israelis and Palestinians to further suffering. There's only one way to achieve sustained quiet in Israel and build a peaceful and prosperous Gaza. Hamas must be disarmed, Gaza must be demilitarized, and the international community must divorce itself from the romantic notion of Hamas as freedom fighters. Hamas has been clear about its intentions. It is a genocidal organization committed to the destruction of Israel and the murder of the Jewish people.
That was Ron Prosser, Israel's ambassador to the UN, defending Israel in the UN Security Council. Thomas, you regularly go to the United Nations. Can you describe for us how hostile that environment is for Israel and how difficult it is for Israel to get her message out, despite how eloquent Ron Prosser is in his words in defense of Israel?
Well, we see it on and on again, and we saw it in the General Assembly when when Ambassador Prosser speaks. People listen, but he is very isolated. It has to do with the organization of the UN, and you know that the United Nations, it works through groups, regional groups, and other groups, and the enemies of Israel, mainly the Islamic States, International Organization of Islamic States, the Arab League, the Non-Aligned Movement, they have the numbers. And I think exactly as he said, they have the numbers, but they don't have the moral. What Israel is lacking is really an infrastructure. And you know, of course, the US, Canada, Australia, other nations may from time to time come out and support them and say something, but they do not have friends that would stand up and say, well, listen, it cannot be right that Israel will all, time and time have to defend itself. We should do it. You know, Great Britain, this country should do it. The United States should do it. The European Union should do it. Countries which share the same heritage should stand up for the only democracy in the Middle East. We are trying to do as a coalition, step by step, to network and to find these friends who would come in agreement to say, listen, we're going to come to an event where we are not going to demonize Israel, but to see all the positive things that Israel is contributing to the international community. And we see it when you talk with UN ambassadors one to one. There's so many who are fed up with this constant antagonism against Israel, and they said, listen, it would be so great if there could be something more constructive. And in September, the 30th of September, we will again host a breakfast, which will be marking the Jewish high holidays, and which will lead up to Yom Kippur, and which will be such a wonderful time of searching your heart, which is the tradition during Yom Kippur, and to ask for forgiveness, for atonement, for seek reconciliation. So I believe, because traditionally those of us who don't like the United Nations, we've just been cursing it, but I believe we need to do something constructive for the sake of Israel.
Which is so important, so important. But I read an interesting article only a couple of weeks ago, which talked about Stephen Harper, and as the Prime Minister of Canada, how he reshaped Canadian foreign policy on the grounds of ethical and moral issues, and right at the heart of this was to defend Israel and the Jewish people, which is incredible. So it surely shows that. That we have to align ourselves as nations, Western nations, with our proud democracy and the freedoms that we have in our nations, is thanks to our Judean Christian heritage, and that Israel's on this front line struggle and battle against Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic terrorism, that if they were allowed or had the ability, we'd see a mass genocide against the Jewish people and against Israel, the likes we haven't seen really since the Holocaust. So therefore, surely it's sensible for the UN, Western nations such as the United States, Canada, and Europe to defend the only true democracy in the Middle East. That actually this is where European values stem from in the first place.
I absolutely agree, and as I said so many times on this program, when you walk into the United Nations headquarters in New York, what you see right across the headquarters is this famous Isaiah wall, Isaiah 2, the global universal vision for peace. Where does it come from? People always quote it, but where does it come from? It comes from a Jewish prophet, a young Jewish prophet, Isaiah. And we should say so.
Absolutely. Of course we should say so. We're down to the last 10 minutes of the program, Thomas. I really want to focus what we focused on earlier now is the implications of all this, particularly as we're seeing now unprecedented rises of anti-Semitism. There's a Jewish organisation based here in London called the Community Service Trust, CST, who not only provide protection for the Jewish community, but they also are the main ones that report to the police on anti-Semitic instances. And they said during the July of 2014, there's been an increase of 100% in anti-Semitic incidences in Britain. I try to think what's happening in Europe. We've seen mosques, we've seen synagogues in Israel, in France attacked and firebombed. We've seen synagogues attacked in Germany as well. And there's a sense of feeling now amongst the Jewish communities across Europe that things are getting very, very scary indeed. Isn't it time that our European leaders really start to take this issue of anti-Semitism very seriously? Otherwise, we would actually lose our very own freedoms and democracy as well.
Absolutely, and as I said before, you know how democracy works. Our elected leaders, they are not, they're our leaders. They will follow. They don't always lead, and as your foreign secretary said, he said, "Well, look at my inbox in with all the emails coming in." That is ultimately what will help to formulate their policies. So it means that when we started European Coalition for Israel in 2003, and I spoke with Elie Wiesel, the Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor, and he said, what makes me so disappointed and discouraged today when I see the rise of anti-Semitism, that was in 2003, he said, well, it's only the Jewish people again who are speaking up. Where are all the others? And that's where we founded the European Coalition for Israel, and we said, this is a coalition of all the others. And I believe, again, it's one of those kairos moments where we as Christians, if there's ever a time that we need to speak up, this is the time. And we need to be vocal, we need to be informative, we need to not to be extremists. Sometimes we may have to be radical, but not to be extreme. But nevertheless to firmly and gently stand by the side of the Jewish people in media, on the street, in our churches, in the office, and say that, you know, when we have to choose between terror and freedom, we choose freedom.
Absolutely. And let's look at the next generation, particularly with this rise of hatred towards Israel, the rise of anti-Semitism on university campuses, and let's see what's happening on our university campuses here in Britain.
You have that.
University. For some, it's the road to riches. For others, the path to the endless party. But for many students, it's the time to broaden one's mind and begin to shape the world we live in. University has always been a crucible for social change and reform. Civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, end the war in Iraq. Let's give peace a chance. But for years, there has been one issue that has evoked more passion and hostility than many others.
Israel is a terrorist state! 5, 6, 7, 8! Israel is a terrorist state! Israel is a terrorist state!
This is not only an issue on British campuses. It's taking centre stage in Europe, America, and worldwide.
I think fortunately the vast majority of students on British campuses are not hostile to Jews or hostile to Israel. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize that there are developments that have to trouble us.
Liberate Al-Quds! March to Al-Quds! Liberate Gaza! Fight for Gaza!
I don't think that legitimate criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. People are perfectly entitled to criticise Israel as long as the criticism is fair. But when it crosses the line...
On the one hand, criticism against Israel can be part of a normal dialogue of ideas and is necessary for a democracy. However, for many, there's also a feeling that something about this just doesn't sit right. The question is the activity we are seeing part of a healthy freedom of expression? Or is there a problem on our campuses and in our society? Has criticism crossed the line?
I think we should all be very concerned about this rise of anti-Semitism and hatred against Israel that we're seeing being spilled out onto our streets across Europe, including violence as well. Thomas, I really think we have to talk about the next generation, and sadly we've only got a minute and a half towards the end of the program, but we've got to empower the youth, don't we? The students who are taking their exams, those at university, with the knowledge and understanding of Israel, so they can stand with their fellow Jewish students and stand for Israel.
Absolutely, and it means for organizations such as ours, we have to look through how we work. You know, we know those in their teens, early 20s today, they live in a different world. How you take in information, how you process information. But we made a policy decision with ECI. We said we are going to invest more in the young generation. We have already groups of young adults, young leaders that we are gathering to teach international law and to try to empower them. But we need to do more.
Thomas, I thank you so much for being my guest today on the European Report, and it's great to have you in our studios here in London. And I want to thank you all for watching today's European Report. I heard it from Thomas's own words that we need to be more active, that we need to support Israel and the Jewish community by writing letters to editors, to journalists, to our MPs. Now's the time to raise our voice for Israel. So thank you for watching today's European Report.